Hi, Simon. Good to speak with you.
Hi, Carl.
And as I mentioned before, we're not going to do any kind of formal introduction here. So if you can just give us a bit of background about yourself, maybe talk about your teaching career and the work that you've done.
Okay, so as an educational psychologist, early on, before they changed it to a doctorate, there was a requirement that you had to have been a teacher. So I trained to be a primary school teacher, and I was a deputy head in a primary school for a number of years. And then I went on and did the master's conversion course to become an educational psychologist. So that was really useful grounding. We had an early, I think it was probably one of the first ASD units that was attached to a mainstream school. So that was a really useful experience. And then I went to Exeter University and did the year's course in about '98. And then following that, I worked at loads of different authorities for varying lengths of time. I ran courses to train teachers for, working with children with autism, and hundreds of parents came and did the Signet course that I ran, which was very much my baby. I brought it into the local authority that I was working in, and we had a couple of Bristol University research projects, and they evaluated it, and it was, we had like 98%, 4 or 5 satisfaction levels out of every respondent. So it was really well received, and I ran an ASD course for teachers as well, which originally started off as a sort of CPD course, and I think it was linked to Oxford Brookes or something. So that was a really good thing. So yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So that was, you said you started doing that in '98, is that right?
Yeah, 1998, and then I worked for a number of different authorities, and then throughout the course of my career, I became linked with a diagnostic group for one of the health authorities, and it went through a couple of different iterations. The first one was it was kind of funded by like all the different authorities. All the different professional groups that were working in there, they kind of they gave the time freely, but more latterly it was all it had to be a sort of paid for service. So it was a bit more streamlined, but it was a useful sort of thing for me to do. And I also developed assessment tools that were really useful for the paediatricians. So I was very much embedded in that kind of diagnostic process.
Right. Okay. Well, okay. So before that, I mean, what was it that brought you into that line of work? Was there a particular drive that you had to work in that very specific field?
Do you mean as an educational psychologist, or the autism? Or
the autism in particular? Was it a natural progression from the educational psychology, or was there something more?
Yeah, I mean, I can remember thinking when I was about 18, oh, I'd like to become an educational psychologist and work with children with autism. But it was such a long path, I just thought I'd never manage to do it. It was like, because you had to get a psychology degree, and then you had to get a teaching qualification, then you had to teach for like a minimum of 2 years, and then it would have been able to get the post, some sort of management experience, and then you had to do a master's qualification. It just sounded like it was never going to happen.
It sounds like
when
you talk about it.
Yeah. So when you're 18, you think, yes, that's what I'd like to do, but it doesn't feel very real, but several decades later, here I am. Oh my God, I said out loud, several decades later. That sounds a long time.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. It's funny when people ask me how long I've been teaching, and you kind of think about it and go, no, that can't be right. Is that right? The time does seem to to drag on a bit. Hey. So the choice to do educational psychology, then, to study that, you already had in mind that you wanted to work in special needs in particular?
Yeah, I mean that is the role, that's the role of an educational psychologist. So
right. So that's interesting. So when you studied it, because I find the the field of study interesting, educational psychology, because I do teacher training and I work with teachers. And one of the things that I try to do with the teachers I work with is, and I like to think that I do this more than others do, is I like the teachers to kind of understand why we do some of the things we do. So rather than just giving them a bunch of practices and say, this is what you should do in the classroom, we spend a little bit more time kind of diving into why this works and why this doesn't work, and how students are responding. So for that, I do a lot of educational psychology reading, but I've not studied it formally, and so I'm not an educational psychologist, but I refer to educational psychology as a field of study, right?
Yeah. I mean, when I did my initial teacher training, we had one afternoon on special needs. One afternoon. That was to cover everything, and I understand now that that's not uncommon.
Still now, I think, right? Still now, probably. Is, I would say, the case. I mean, again, I'm not formally trained as a teacher either, but the training that I have done, the general training I've done, very rarely talks about it. And I must admit, actually, and I've had this conversation recently on social media a few times, and it's something I'm looking to improve. But I must admit, when I work with teachers, it's not something I go into a great deal of depth on, because it's not something I have a background in or a strength in myself. So it is something that's just it's dreadfully lacking in the whole industry, I think. And I also think that a lot of teachers can just get by for a long time without it being a problem, because they might never, at least not obviously, have a student in their class where they realize that they might need it. You can go a long time before you realize, I'm really lacking here.
I think that it's about degrees of difficulty, because some of the children that I would work with would probably never come into the sphere of the further and higher education, and the ones that are able to make it into that sort of sphere are likely to have something like a hidden difficulty. So they may have dyslexia, they may have a social communication difficulty, they may have obviously autism, they may have like attention deficit disorder, and if they've managed to make it past those various levels, then their difficulties are possibly less noticeable. So it's about, I think, I mean, you're working with adult learners, I'm assuming. So
a mixture, but I mean, I now mostly work with teachers, but for my students, a mixture.
So once you get into the working with adult learners, several of the difficulties would have fallen to the wayside.
Sure.
That doesn't mean, well, when I say it would be the obvious difficulties that have fallen to the wayside, but those which are more hidden are ones that either the young people or adults manage themselves, or are things that make it only noticeable during interaction. And you might find a person difficult to get on with, but actually underlying that may be an anxiety disorder, or a whole host of things that need to be accommodated.
And arguably, they're in some ways worse off perhaps. I mean, if they they've managed to make it this far, as it were, so they've obviously they've jumped the hurdles, and they've made it through each level of school, and they've obviously kind of succeeded to some degree. But if their needs are going unnoticed, then they're obviously being failed on some level, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. I mean, I guess that is really why, as a sort of as part of pedagogy, that we ought to be looking at the needs of the learner. And I mean, it's it's depending on the length of your course, it would just be as simple as doing some form of getting some feedback about preferred learning styles. A very simple, without being too intrusive, a simple questionnaire looking at something like levels of anxiety, or things you might need to know about me, or asking them to write a pen picture, or describing difficulties they've had in education in the past or whatever. You know, it's just about showing some form of empathy and
Sure.
you know, going with it really. So
something that strikes me as interesting then, relatively recently, we're talking really in the last couple of years, I think, we are seeing more awareness of the holistic child, as it were. So, you know, more of an interest in the education system, in the personality of students and the anxieties and just the general mental health as a broad, not for special needs, but just as a general concept. Do you think that that just that broadening of awareness is having a positive impact on schooling for children with special needs? Is that something that's helping them? What do you think?
Well, I mean, there's kind of two levels there, because as part of an individual, and if you've got a recognised special educational need and you've got a statement, then part of the assessment at the beginning will look at social, emotional, mental health, and so there will be a specified. There's an area within that sort of structure of that document that will specify what provision needs to be made, and that will be specific. But you're right. Currently in the UK, there's a sort of a move to put a mental health lead into each school, and that will give, you know, staff that will give one person the responsibility to look at the wider area of mental health within the school, and that can be all kinds of innovations that, you know, that might be put into place. You know, specific people, specific ways of working, specific ways of monitoring, all of that kind of information. And obviously that'll have a trickle-down effect, because people will be thinking about themselves and others perhaps a little bit more. And also it starts at the top of the structure. It's where we would look to see, you know, will you know, how much commitment does a head teacher have to providing all of that? You know, and senior staff, you know, are they in agreement with the whole structure and framework? And how does the mental health sort of interventions and whatever they're putting in place as a program, how does that overlap with the behaviour policy? So I mean, a lot of children who have emotional and social difficulties fall foul of the behaviour policy, and they end up going to the pointy end. And that's kind of, so yeah, in essence, you know, more focus on mental health can only be a good thing, really.
Okay. A couple of things that you mentioned there got me thinking as well, about when I was in school. Occasionally there would be a student who had a support teacher, you know, kind of side by side with them throughout their school.
Yeah, like a teaching assistant. Yeah,
right. And they'd be assigned to a particular student who needed them. Do you have an opinion on, you know, that setup? Is that the right way of doing things? And also, when you're doing that, is it sufficient? Do you think is it sufficient that the assistant is there for the student, and therefore the core teacher, the lead teacher, doesn't need so much training? What are your thoughts about this?
Oh, that's a very good question. That is a really current question. So basically, as to the first part, obviously it depends on the level of need of the child, but the overarching goal of all of that sort of support is that gradually the TA withdraws, and depending on the level of need, it's a bit, because there are so many children with so many different levels of need and areas of need, you can't say a global, this is the aim, because they would be different in each case. But where possible, it would be useful to withdraw the amount of support that is needed, because you're scaffolding the school experience for the young person, or rather the TA or the teaching assistant is scaffolding that process. So you want to withdraw it as much as possible. So that's the first thing. And I mean, obviously I could go on at length about that, but I'll shelve that for the moment. The second issue regarding should a teacher have, I mean, there's two parts to that should the teacher have a level of understanding of a child? Yes, they should, because they've got a particular child in their class with those levels of need. You can't expect a TA to be in charge. And also, the buck stops with the teacher, to use a kind of a sort of a general term. The teacher is in fact responsible for the learning of the child. Just because they've got a TA with them, it doesn't mean they can hand over the learning to the TA. There are some the majority of TAs are fantastic. I'm not saying the minority aren't, but what I'm saying is the majority of teaching assistants do far more than what would be expected, and they're really, really good. And they have a good relationship with the young person. They understand the needs of the young person, and oftentimes they may have even been a teacher and they're doing this because they're wanting to do something else. And they may even do their own professional development in the area of special need. But it's really important that the teacher doesn't just say, right, over to you. If I was a TA and the teacher said, right, over to you, that wouldn't be a good thing, because really the teacher should have oversight of the learning of the child. And they should be providing an overarching curriculum in cooperation and collaboration with the teaching assistant, but they very much need to be providing that curriculum and that support for the teaching assistant. So it's like a paired role. The TA is very much an extension of the teacher, but nevertheless is a sort of an autonomous, sort of individual within that. That was a very long-winded answer, but it was full of detail.
It's good. So a couple of things I'm not fully aware of then. The TA, as you've already alluded to there, it's going to be different for every individual. They're going to have a different background but generally speaking, the people who become a TA, these people, what kind of professional background do they have? Are they generally professional teachers, or are they professional social workers?
It depends on the school context, but when you think about the potential level of remuneration for a TA and the time, the time frame, which is from sort of 9 a.m. or 8:30 a.m. till 3. So many of them will be mums who are doing it to fit in because they've got a child, or they might be older ladies, or even, I'm not just saying ladies, because more recently I've been working with sort of young men who've got into the area and are doing it, and sometimes and I've been meeting quite a few who are doing it in order to become a teacher, so they've already got that interest. So there are different reasons for becoming a TA. One is that it's convenient. The other is that it may be a springboard into the profession of teaching. But I would say the majority of TAs don't have a great professional background. They may. I wouldn't really like to guess the qualifications that they may even have, because that might sound sort of pejorative, but it may be as far as A levels. It may, the majority may stop before they get to doing a degree level, degree level education.
No, I get you. I get that. That paints a picture for me. Good. So the work that you do, the training that you do, has normally been with lead teachers rather than teaching assistants. Is that right?
The training that I've done for autism. It's with everybody. I mean, it really does depend on who is wanting the training. I have actually run courses that have been specifically for TAs, and I've run. But they may not have just been on autism. So it might have been, managing children in the early years, or behaviour management, or ASD, or attachment disorder, or of a wide variety of things, and those might be specifically for TAs or for teachers or for groups of special needs coordinators or whoever's kind of wanting it. But I have run courses specifically for TAs. They get a lot out of it, and you know, they work very hard, considering you know, there isn't much of a career progression in it. It's not like teaching where you can become a head teacher. You may be able to become an AHLTA, which is a sort of a higher level teaching assistant.
Like a coordinating role, or?
I think it's more of a specialist role. You may be able to somewhat take over from a teacher in certain circumstances, and it may indicate that you actually want to become a teacher. Right. So it is a really useful path.
Yeah, no, I'm getting a better picture now of what it is. So having worked with those different groups of people, the teachers, the TAs. You said you've done some work with the admin side as well, and also you've worked with parents. What different kinds of motivation or different kinds of perspectives, different kind of drives have you found when you're running a training program, a workshop with, for example, a group of parents compared with a group of TAs, compared with a group of teachers? Are they approaching things differently, do you find, in your interactions?
Yeah, I think... so if I just focus on the autism, because that's the one that I've done most for teachers, and so the parents are coming because they've got a child with autism. So it takes, and the normal cycle is that a parent will think to themselves, well, my child is responding in an unusual way. You know, teachers might start saying, well, do you think your child, you know, has got a social communication disorder? They then see their GP, and then they go on, and then they see a pediatrician. They go through the whole process. They see other professionals, and then after about 2 years, they get a diagnosis. Right. It's on the course that I run, you know, in the first session, we do a bit on what was the reaction that you got, or how did you feel when you heard the words, your child has got a diagnosis of autism? And there is a whole host of emotions. I would say that 60 to 80% of parents have a sensation of, you know, of somewhat relief tinged with a little bit of kind of a sense of bereavement for their typical child. So their motivation is that they are coming to learn more about how to support their own child. Yeah. So they very much bring with them a kind of a schema or a mental mapping of their own child, and try and make sense of everything that I say during the 6 or 10 week course, which will cover a whole host of stuff. And they're coming with it's actually quite a different motivation to teachers. It's understandable because they come from a very personal standpoint. So that is the parents. So, and then the TAs may be coming a slightly different direction, because they're feeling, they may feel, you know, that the course that they're attending is it might have been the last time they came to a course was, you know, 10 years ago, and that might have been their you know, an A-level that they did, or an A-level that they did, you know, CS level, so something to do that. So they're often a bit anxious about the course. They feel that they may be sort of, you know, biting off a little bit more that they can chew, but we always tailor it for, you know, for whatever level, and they bring a lot with them. They can demonstrate their enthusiasm. They can generate questions and hypotheses and look for answers, and they always go away with something really useful. And there's always at the end, there's always a common kind of understanding that they want to go and try something when they leave. They have an aha moment. They go aha, and then they always want to try something when they go back. So we might,
classroom. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we might be talking social stories, we might be talking conversations, we might be talking adjusting the environment for the sensory needs, all of that kind of stuff. And then the teachers come at a different level because they know children more, they know about the teaching system more. They feel that they're at a level where if they expose what they don't know, that might come as a professional threat to them. So you need to break down that barrier. So it's about accepting what you don't know and being open to learning and saying, yes, in this particular case, I'm not the expert, because teachers have to feel that they're the expert in everything, which is understandable. Yeah. I mean, when I go on courses with other educational psychologists, it's exactly the same. Everybody feels that they have to be the expert, and there will be one person who's teaching them some information about attachment disorder, and everybody's kind of saying, yeah, well, we kind of know about this, and that's the same with teachers. So you need to get over these points.
No, I try to be a good student as much as I can, but I know, it can be tough sometimes when you're sitting in the room. Good. I do want to go a little bit deeper on that, though, if you can. Some of the pushback maybe from the teachers and also from the parents, I suspect, but you can put me straight, I suspect you'll get some pushback in both sides. The teachers maybe even obviously accepting that you know the psychology better than they do. So okay, you're the expert here, I'm the teacher, you're the expert, you know this better than I do. But maybe the teacher, maybe I might feel that I have a better sense of what's good for education, and maybe I might think that some of what you're saying clashes with some of what I know about teaching. And then as a parent, maybe I'm listening to you, okay, you're the expert, but this is my child, and that doesn't sound right for me and my child. Do you get much of this pushback, and how do you handle it?
I think by the time it's the way the course is structured. So for the parents, and the parents' course and the teachers' courses are quite different, and they're structured differently, although they would cover similar content. So for the parents' course, you're very much saying, you're the expert, you're bringing the knowledge of your child with you, we've got the information, this is what you need to know, we can steer you through this complex problem and issues, and there's always a chance to talk about it at the end of the session or during the coffee break or whenever, to flesh it out. And it's very much at the beginning they're sharing their stories, and we're learning as we go along, and it's about developing a group. It's about developing parents' confidence in sharing the issues with the rest of the group, and also with me as the sort of course leader. And then they become more and more comfortable, because each time there's something that's raised, I can provide an answer which they're happy with, until they feel confident that all I'm really doing is giving them a structure for solving problems as they may occur. I think parents come with the impression that we're going to give them, or I'm going to give them, right, here's the answer for this situation, and here's the answer for this situation, but it's really, we give them a framework for understanding the strengths and difficulties of a young person, knowing what strategies are, and then implementing them in a kind of reflective manner, whereby you say, well, this has worked, this hasn't worked, let's try this, and taking it forward. Teachers, it can be experiential learning, it can be very much sort of the pedagogical model, where you stand up at the front and tell them stuff. Obviously, everything that we do in educational psychology is embedded within the education system, rather than the other way around. So we already understand the structure of how things work in school. So, I don't think there's that much difference between, or perceived difference. I mean, teachers won't say, oh, you don't know what it's like to teach and you're very much separate, because you know, that is our bread and butter. We work within schools.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we know the code of practice really well. We know all, you know, we understand the school structure. We don't really operate anywhere else other than within schools. So they appreciate that, and we're coming from that shared understanding. Right, okay. So I think that's a really positive standpoint.
That is good, yeah, that is good. I wonder what's the flip side of that. So you know the context very well, which allows you to work closely with the teachers and have that relationship, which sounds good. Given that you're working in that context, and given that the work you do, you know, kind of has to fit within the parameters of the school system, what are the limitations that you face? What are the things that you are restricted by then?
I suppose there's the pressure of the wider kind of local authority context, which is that it's about resources. So you aren't able to overpromise things. So on the one hand, you have the school saying we need this, and on the other hand, you have the local authority saying, yeah, but if everybody needs this, there won't be enough for everybody. Yeah. So there's two opposing pressures. Yeah. There may be a tendency, and this needs to be avoided, you know, and this is brought to our attention. There may be an attention to sort of almost collude with the school, because you know, yeah, things are going well. If you don't challenge the school, then things just go on as they are. So that's the other side. You need to say to schools, you need to develop a relationship with the schools and be and have the strength of personality to say, well, yeah, things are going okay, but have you tried this? Or actually, by doing this and this, which is easy for the school, the impact on the child is not as good as if you did this and this. So it's a very fine line. I have colleagues, or I've worked with colleagues in the past who are so sort of vociferous with working with the schools that they kind of come head to head, and you know, and there's conflict. And that's not a good way to work with a school. And the flip side of that is that you just say, oh yeah, you're doing well, let's just blah, 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 blah. And it's nothing happens. They can just make no progress. So, yeah.
Good. And I wonder as well, you talk about resources, and that's obviously going to be, I mean, in all of education, that's where the rubber meets the road, is what do we have the budget for and what's the funding going to cover. I wonder if you get any sense from the individuals, from the students, what kind of message they feel is being sent about them as people, about them as individuals, when these kind of, you know, you get resource discussions and you get policy discussions about what we can cover and what we're going to prioritize. Do the students have you ever heard from the students, or do they ever speak about how that makes them feel and what kind of
I think they're so remote from the process for the majority of the time. I don't think, and also when you think about them being, you know, if a child is very young, they don't really understand the implication of a household budget, let alone the impact of
state budget for education.
Yeah. So they may, I think it may very much revolve around the ethos of the school. I know some older children may kind of, you know, they understand that they've got special needs as a thing. They may understand that they're different to other young people. They may understand that they need other things, and, you know, things that other children don't have. But I've never come across something which I would describe as a general sort of view. You know, I've never come across as like, yeah, lots of children always feel like X or Y, because there are so many different variables involved. You know, what the school would say, what the parents would say, what the teachers would say as individuals, what a TA would say. So it's I mean, it's a good point, but it probably would benefit from an area of study in itself. And I'm sure someone has done, you know, some of the trainee educational psychologists may have done that as a research project, but I'm not aware as of yet.
Some further reading perhaps for me. Okay. So your career has been in the UK exclusively?
Yes, yeah. Okay. I mean, I'd like to, I often look to see, oh, New Zealand, that looks a nice place to do some And I've got an ex-colleague went over to New Zealand, and she's done some work. One of the people that I trained with early on went to somewhere, I can't, the Far East or some, people do go abroad and do different places, but I'm not sure that the structure of education is the same. And I think the role in Australia is slightly different, and the role in New Zealand is slightly different.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wonder, when you decided that was the line of work you wanted to get into, you wanted to be training teachers and training parents. Was there just a general sense that you wanted to help out more teachers and more parents and spread that support? Or was there something that you felt was missing, that you feel, I mean, for example, you said you kind of designed your own program, right? The program you deliver is your own kind of development, I think. Something that you offer that you think wasn't being offered before?
Okay, I think so basically I'll clarify some bits here. So first of all, the autism training is one thread of many things that I do, but it was a very large thread. I mean, it's more like a big piece of wool than a little thread. It's like a big piece of what I do, or have done. But the other parts are things like assessment. So I would, work out the cognitive ability of a child, assess their emotional and social bits. I would write statements to find out what their entitlement is and find out what their special educational needs are and see how they fit within the code of practice. I'd attend a lot of meetings. I do whole school training, whole staff training. I entered the profession to become an educational psychologist, and I happened to go down that pathway, which was the autism. Just to kind of clarify that bit. Was there another question?
I think that's it. I'm just kind of interested in I guess the focus of your training and what you do. And I'm also intrigued because I asked about where you've been based in the UK, and I wonder if you have any sense of how the UK fares against other countries. I mean, I live here in Indonesia, and I've spent a few years teaching in the schools here, and there's almost no system in place for special needs or SEL is an unknown term here. And I remember in particular, I worked in a few different schools. And I remember thinking, when I started working in schools, there really wasn't, because I didn't have any background in special needs education, and it really wasn't a problem for me because I never had any noticeable special needs in my classes. And then I worked in a school where every class that I would teach, so I was teaching, I think, grades 7 and 8, for example, and there'd be 3 or 4 classes at each grade. So say I had 8 different classes, and every class that I would teach would have, 3 to 5 clearly clear students in clear special need, and every class that I taught in would have 1 or 2 teaching assistants who were sat beside the student for the entire class. And I thought, well, what is going on here where I've taught in 4 different schools and had maybe 1 or 2 special needs students overall, and now I'm in this school and I've got maybe 20 different students across a handful of classes. So I spoke to the school about it, and they basically told me that because there's no system in place, many of the schools don't have the support. It's not necessarily their fault. They're just, they're not getting the support from the government. They're not getting the teachers don't have the training, and so on and so forth. And because there's a highly privatized education system here, schools can largely choose who they admit. What was happening was that most schools, if they had applicants with clear special needs, they just wouldn't admit them to the school. And it happened that this other school that I was teaching at just had a much more open policy, and they were the one school that would accept these students, and therefore they ended up being the school where all those students ended up. Even that school didn't have a great system in place. They just were accepting the students, and that but they didn't have a massive budget to deal with it. They weren't an amazing school in any way. They just happened to say yes where other schools had said no. And that's kind of the state of affairs, as it were, for Indonesia. I wonder if you have any sense how the UK compares around the world. What is the UK doing? Anything that other countries aren't, or what's your sense there?
Well, I mean, it's for all its flaws, it's highly structured. You know, there's legislation in place. There's the code of practice, which is applicable in England, and I think Scotland have got a slightly different code of practice, and Wales are still operating on the 2014 code of practice. Okay. And so there's a lot of legislation in place, which means that needs have to be identified, and as a consequence, there is the support that is available through that process. I mean, parents would argue that it's not sufficient because most people would want everybody wants everything for their child, and everyone wants the best, and it's unfortunate that we have a limited resource, but I'm just trying to think about other countries. I don't really I mean, we get a lot of research from America, and we get a lot of research from New Zealand and Australia, and I think some of the other research that we have isn't translated, but everybody seems to be working in the same areas in terms of special needs. Everybody's looking at the sort of ADHD side, or the autism side, or the early childhood experiences, the ACEs stuff, where people may have had traumatic early experiences. And that is a bit of a driver for things. And there's shared experience and shared information. But to be honest, it's very difficult for me to know what's going on in different countries, because there's no forum for it. You know, there's no international psychology sort of forum where everybody meets up. And I think it's slightly, I was saying that the Australian and New Zealand psychology services are slightly different. I think the American psychology services are slightly different as well. And they may adopt more of a school counsellor model. I don't know. That may not be true, but from what I understand, that might be. I'm sure somebody would correct me if I'm wrong. But
I wonder as well, have there been, in your career, have there been any kind of breakthroughs on the more clinical side, where people are are studying the condition? So you've got research into autism on the clinical side. Has there been any breakthroughs during your career that has changed your line of work in any way? Anything that we now know that we didn't before?
No, I mean, I think when I first started some years ago, it was when in the field, this refers to the field of autism, it was really people were thinking of autism as a condition that that only had 3 areas of difficulty, and people hadn't fully appreciated the impact of sensory sensitivities, so sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, proprioceptive and vestibular, and then the intramuscular, the internal side, which is that's a new one, relatively new.
Right. Okay.
So that I would have said, of all of the things in terms of autism, that seems to be the biggest thing that's kind of come up. There are various different structures that have and methodologies that are put in place on a cyclical basis, about how to work with children, how to work with families, how to understand the needs of young people, and different methodologies. But they generally have a similar sort of focus around same areas. I think fundamentally it's been very similar. But there have just been some sort of tweaks around the edges about ways of working.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You used a couple of words there. I won't pretend I know. Do you mind giving us a brief definition? I think you said proprioceptor and vestibular. What are they?
So these are kind of things. So all of the senses have different, lay terms and fancy specialist terms. So you get, sight, which is the visual, olfactory, which is smell, and then you get auditory, which is obviously hearing, and then you get proprioceptive is an individual's ability to know where their body is in space. So an individual with autism if they've got proprioceptive difficulties, they may not know, for instance, they may have problems putting on items of clothing because they're not able to judge where their body is in space. And if you ask them to close their eyes, like all that kind of stuff, they won't be able to do that. It's very similar to post-stroke syndrome. So I had a colleague who had a stroke on one side, was very much able to get back to work, but because he had a proprioceptive difficulty, if he put a pen down on one side, he'd forget that the object was there.
Yeah, okay.
So in terms of autism, it may mean that you don't know how close to stand to somebody, and which is really off-putting. You may bump into people in the corridor. So there's lots of things. And the other one was vestibular, which is balance. So it comes from the inner ear and being able to balance. So if you're hypersensitive, you're oversensitive to balance. So you would find that if you go like to one or the other side, or you go backwards or forwards, you might feel as if you're falling over. And if you're hyposensitive, which is undersensitive, you may need to stimulate yourself by doing lots of shaking stuff.
Which I'm kind of familiar with. Okay, I see. Okay, interesting. What did I want to ask then? There was something then I wanted to ask. I'm not sure. So what do you think though are the areas, you talked a little bit about the career you've had and some of the changes that you've seen and the things that you've been through. What do you think at the moment are the areas that are most lacking, either in the school system or just the government system? What do you hope for? What do you think needs to be improved upon?
I mean, I guess the sort of mental health stuff is a real biggie. I mean, it's you know, people are picking up on it, and it is really important. And also, I mean, mental health, but going right back to the start of a child's life, is recognizing that things that happen to very young children have a significant impact on them throughout their lives.
Right.
So we know that very early sort of experiences can have a knock-on effect and affect them to the point where they're unable to learn and they're unable to make development. And if you know hierarchies Maslow of needs,
right.
Where you have all of the basic needs on the bottom and self-actualization is the top one, where people are struggling with things around there, they will find it very difficult to meet their potential. So, you know, it is a thing that we need to really start focusing in on. And there's a lot of good work that surrounds it, but it's, you know, I think in the past, lots of people have felt that, oh, you know, it's not worth mentioning that such and such happened when a child was only 3 because they were only 3 and they won't remember it. But children remember. Children remember experiences that their mother had in utero in a sort of overall sort of way. So if the mum had high levels of anxiety, then that anxiety will be passed on to the baby. And there's all kinds of research in all different areas.
Right.
So, you know, I think that's got to be something that needs to take a center stage. And I mean, one of the major things at the moment will be how children return to school after lockdown. So I've just recently made a couple of videos on promoting readiness to return to school in children after the lockdown, and it's about how we prepare them in terms of normalizing the situation. So I did one video for parents, and then it was actually the same video, but I'd spoken for like an hour and 35 minutes, so I had to chop it in half.
Okay.
So, I mean, even with a bit of editing, I got rid of some of it. But that will be a massive focus. There is so much, you know, we know that people can transmit anxiety, so the parent's anxiety will be transmitted to the child. And if children are anxious when they return to school, then they'll pick it up from teachers as well. And if you know, if everybody's like that, then there's not going to be the readiness to return to school. There's not going to be the readiness to learn. You know, and there are lots of things that people can do. There's lots of things that parents can do. And the things that parents can do for a child with an additional educational need, or a typically developed child will be similar. You know, it's like saying, you know, I'm going to start getting your school ready, your school clothes ready, because you're going back to school, you know, and all those kind of things. And where's your book bag? Where's your lunchbox? Because you're going back to school. It's you know, it's like an inevitability. I mean, it doesn't help that every time you turn on the telly, there's like really lots of very scary stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I think those are the areas. There's the immediate need of post-COVID, although we're actually still in the throes of it, and then other things around that.
That makes me wonder. Some of what you just said about returning to schools in the current climate, and also some of the where we've touched on mental health a little bit. I imagine the teachers that train with you to, you know, better prepare themselves for working with special needs children and children with autism in particular. But I imagine they must get a lot out of that they can apply to just more broadly to their student body, right?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, that is the thing. People often say, well, how am I going to make all of these changes when I've got everything for it? But we always say, you know, what is good practice for children with autism is good practice for like 99.9% of children. It's all about creating, you know, predictability. It's all about structure. It's all about routines. It's all about making things clear. It's all about reducing the levels of ambiguity. And all of that is really making things visual. All of those things are really good for children with autism. It would be very rare that a child didn't respond. So a child who had maybe, there's something called pathological demand avoidance, which is, it's not actually a diagnosis, it's a collection of features, and it's thought to be a subgroup of children with autism, although it's not got a formal DSM-5, which is the American diagnostic manual. But they react in a very different way. They don't like structure. They don't like being told what to do. They like so for those children, that would be very difficult. But you're not going to be getting all of those children.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Can you give us a couple of maybe highlights? So you mentioned, you know, the training that you do, perhaps the training with the parents and also with the teachers, where you're talking about particular strategies, techniques, activities, and things that can be implemented. Are there any particular highlights you can just give us? A couple of kind of, you know, short bullet points about what teachers should be doing, what parents should be doing. What are the main things that you think would warrant mentioning?
I mean, that's a kind of difficult one because I've got like global sort of understanding.
I get that.
So it's kind of the things that I was talking about. It's about making everything obvious. It's about providing visual structure. And when I say visual structure, it's rather than just telling a child, you know, we're going to be doing X, Y, and Z. You might want to have a visual timetable of it.
Sure.
Rather than just saying, right, today's lesson is going to be about such and such and such and such, you would write it on the board or put it in pictures. Having a regular routine in order that children aren't suddenly going to be asked to do something that they're unprepared for. Making, you know, having clear areas within the room so that children know they're supposed to do something in one area and something in another area. Being aware of the different sensory sensitivities of young people. Like some children, I mean, these are the competing things. Like some children can't work if it's too noisy.
Yeah.
Some children can't work if it's too quiet.
Sure.
So how do you balance that one? So there are things like using, you know, ear defenders or for some children and headphones for other children. So it's worth doing like a sensory audit for your class, you know. You know, it's about preparation, really. It's about putting those kind of key things in.
I like that. That's good. That's very useful. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you think I've missed, or anything else you think is interesting here?
Not really. I mean, it's a huge area. It's a really huge area.
Yeah.
And each of the kind of pillars of what we do, you can drill right down in.
Sure.
So, I mean, I've worked for an authority for local authorities for about the last 20 plus years. And I've become an independent educational psychologist.
Okay.
And that's very interesting. I've set up Edge Psychology, which is like it's like a sort of an independent practice.
Okay.
I'm just getting to see lots of different, sort of glimpses into different sort of areas that I wouldn't normally see. But it's it's quite a gratifying
I imagine,
experience, because I'm able to go in, whereas before I was very, very time limited.
Right.
I now have more flexibility to choose exactly the types of assessments that I want to do, the level of depth that I can go into, the types of intervention, and I don't have the same sort of constraints. So, and I can be creative. I can decide that I'm going to get, a different assessment kit and use that. Right. So,
okay. Right. Oh, yeah, that sounds really good. Yeah. Okay. How long have you been doing this, the independent institution?
So basically, I set up independently in about November of last year.
Okay.
So November 2019, after like 20 odd years, I just thought at the time was right. And also people kept asking me, do you do independent work? Do you do independent work? So now when I'm asked, I can say yes. And I'm getting loads and loads of people asking me to do assessments for young people. And I've worked for local authorities, on behalf of local authorities, for social care settings, for independent schools, for state schools, for parents, for nurseries, for any you name it, and I've been doing it. So
I wonder,
so it's interesting.
Hang on. Okay, yeah, good. I wonder, having worked with teachers for quite a long time, presumably you'll have you'll have got a good kind of view of the climate and teachers as a general kind of group. Do you think that teachers are good at diagnosing these things? Do you find that teachers' kind of intuitions are right in this area or not? What's your experience?
I think that that really depends on the sensibilities of a particular teacher.
Okay.
So, I mean, and also there's things like the constraints of what the ethos of the school are. And the structure of so many different factors within that. I mean, it's like, some people are good at this, some people are good at that. Some teachers will be really good at the admin side, maybe. Yeah. Some teachers are good at all of it.
Yeah.
And by the same token, some teachers don't feel confident enough to make those, to call it out, really. And if you've got a class of like 30 children and a lot of them have got different needs, you may not be in a position to call it because you're firefighting on a day-to-day basis of what's going on. So you've got a number of children who've got, social and emotional difficulties.
Yeah, right.
And you may not even be able to recognize one child who's introverted and actually they've got autism. So,
right.
I mean, it would be unfair to characterize a teacher and their capabilities of identifying something on the basis of the fact that they're dealing with a big sort of a big job on that side.
Yeah, of course, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
No, that's fair. And also, no, go on. Go ahead.
No. Go on.
I was moving on. I also, another thing that I was wondering, is there still much of a debate these days on the opposing options of mainstream schooling and kind of isolated special schooling? Is that still a debate, or is that I've not? I don't follow on any of this. So I wonder.
Yeah, I mean, sometime back there was a move that that all children should be accommodated within the mainstream school, and I understand, that some countries, I was thinking of one the other day. I mean, I heard one the other day, and now I can't bring it to mind. But they always have every child goes, unless they are, they have a medical condition, which means that they have to be supported with a health team. They, as much as possible, try and have everybody within a mainstream school. And there was a greater move to that in the UK a few years back, but we do seem to be drifting towards having more and more children in different specialist settings.
Okay. What do you think about that?
It's a difficult question. I mean, some children may benefit from more of a mainstream setting, but in their particular context, it's difficult to support them. I mean, in an ideal world, all children would be within a mainstream school. But there are occasions where that's not possible for the child's own safety, the teachers, being able to, work within a class and the other children's learning. So there are reasons why that's not going to be started. But I mean, default to mainstream is the kind of notion within the UK. But there does seem to be more needs for specialist settings. I don't know whether that means that we have we're recognizing children's needs more, where there are more children's needs because of societal pressure and attachment issues and other factors that we've not actually identified yet. But there certainly is a place for specialist settings that are taking on a very challenging population. Yes, certainly. Certainly. But there's also a need for perhaps a wider level of training for teachers and support, and maybe a slightly different enhanced model within school, because I think teachers are being asked to do ever such a lot with very limited resources.
Yeah. Do you think a school, just a mainstream school, do you think schools in general should have somebody like you on the staff who's a permanent fixture, or do you think it's good for like yourself to be in a more kind of mobile situation where you're moving school to school? What would be the ideal situation?
Well, I mean, I think schools need more EP time, but it's based on a kind of remodeling. So it was, I mean, it's a bit technical. So basically, the funding for EPs was, in the past, it was like top sliced from the school's budget, and then it was paid for, and then each school had an allocation. But now the budgets have been devolved to the schools, and now they buy the services in. And during times when there are other pressures, sometimes it's those kind of things that go. Yeah. So it's sometimes it's like all of those kind of things that go. So, I mean, ideally, schools need a bit of everything. They need, help from lots of different services, but they certainly would benefit from more, because earlier intervention is much better than their kind of later firefighting. So I often come across children who you can't believe have managed to get all the way to sort of secondary school with such a level of problems, and their problems have been misperceived as, they're I don't like to use the term sort of lazy, or I don't like to use the term naughty, and I don't like, but that's how they've been labelled. And if they'd been picked up earlier, then it would have been, then their education would have been so much more fruitful, because people would have recognised the difficulties that they'd had, and would at least try to put some intervention in place, or at least been a somewhat more understanding. So, but the demands of a school are so massive. It's a huge organisation, and there's so many different structures involved.
Yeah. I wonder, with what you just said there, again, something I don't, just my lack of understanding in the area. If you have a child with autism, and they get diagnosed early on, and the right intervention is used, is there a situation where, with the right intervention, their kind of the possibilities might change for that child, where with the right kind of intervention you might find out that they develop more or become more capable than you would have expected, or are the prognoses pretty clear early on?
No, I think, but I mean, it's very variable. It's very variable, and it depends on, there's different. So basically, autism is a difficulty that might be comorbid, which means it happens with. So comorbidity with ADHD, comorbidity with dyslexia, with dyspraxia, with other issues, and then you might have a learning difficulty as well. So if you imagine all those different factors on a graph, it's very difficult to pinpoint that's a typical child with dyslexia. But what you can say is that you can put in place interventions that mean that at least the anxiety that affects young people with autism on a massive scale could be reduced in order that they can access the strengths that they do have. Right. So if you imagine anxiety is the one overriding feeling, and the effects of anxiety means that children are never in a good place to learn, they can't socially interact, they can't remember things, they won't try new things, blah, 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 long list of things. If you can at least alter the school environment, alter the social environment, alter the predictability, all of those kind of things, you can give them a better shot. So you might be able to say a child who had a very good setting at school that is an autism-friendly setting, let's call it an autism-friendly setting, they may progress at a better rate than a child who didn't have any of their needs recognised and was struggling with anxiety and struggling with rigidity, and the language that was used in school was too complex for them, even though they're bright. They don't understand idioms. So in a way, yes, their prospects would be altered, but some people would like to look at the term like, can autism be cured? Right. Which obviously it can't be. Sure. Yeah, obviously it can't be, because it's not that sort of that thing. But you can actually alter the prospects of a child by putting in place a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's exactly the kind of answer I was hoping for. That's really good. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Are there any kind of common misconceptions and misunderstandings about autism or about children with autism that you think you could, any bullet points you could clear up, things that you've come across?
So the biggest one is when people think of young people with autism and they think of Rain Man, and they think that all children or adults or young people with autism have a special skill. Right. An island or an islet of ability, that one thing that they can do, and that simply isn't the case, and that can be quite distressing for parents, because other people will come up to them and say, "Oh, what can your child with autism do? What's their thing?" And they say, "Well, that's not the true case for all."
Right. Yeah. That's
really,
not a comfortable question.
Yeah, it's not a comfortable question, and it really doesn't happen that often. Right, you might have a child who's very good at drawing, and there's one young person with autism who is famous for, I think they will be in their 30s or 40s now, and they do memories from drawing, and they do lovely drawing. You might have seen that, and very good at memory and very good at maths, but those are the isolated cases potentially. Okay. So it would be worth, not, if we could get rid of one sort of misapprehension, that would be the one, really.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. Good. And also, there's a difference between boys and girls. So women present or girls present in a different fashion to boys, but they both have what we would regard as autism, but they would present it in a different way, and it's just worth noting that.
Do you have any? What are the highlights there? Are there any particular things?
Oftentimes, so individuals with autism often have a special interest. So that's why you get kids who are interested in Thomas the Tank Engine, train spotting, hoovers, electric light switches, collecting plastic bits and pieces, and all kinds of very unusual, anything that's about categorization and lists. So for some young people, I'm talking about girls now, so it's not just young people, I'm talking about the girls. Their special interest may be the social world, so they may try to make sense of what's going on in the social world, and that might make them seem as if they appear to fit in. So they might be interested in makeup, and they might be interested in this and that. So, I mean, that's a very superficial element of the differences, but there are more. But that would be the one that seems to be picked up mostly.
Okay, it's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And then somewhat outside of the scope, we've been talking about education. I wonder what you might think, if you have any comments about the environment for autistic adults after they've left school, in the UK in particular, let's say, if that's your area of comfort. Are they well supported in the broader society, do you think?
Well, I mean, it really depends. So there's several factors that come into play here. First of all is whether you've got a learning difficulty with autism, or whether you're more cognitively able, because you would then be fed into different sorts of streams. If you've got a learning difficulty, then you'll probably be more supported. So if you've got, and then within the stream of adults who are more able, you'll have those who've got a diagnosis and those who haven't got a diagnosis. So those with a diagnosis may go off and they may have support in different areas. So the ones without a diagnosis may just kind of flounder throughout life, or they may find their niche, or they may find something that's quite supportive, or whatever. The ones with a diagnosis may be able to go into some, they may be a bright postgrad who goes into a research, like into a, work in an engineering firm. They may declare that they've got autism, and then they may get support. So it depends what stream you end up kind of going down. But people are more understanding of autism. People are more aware of autism. There's more legislation around autism. There's more support that is like recommended, and then there's more support that's actually backed up by legislation. So and there's employment groups that would support autism. There's a variety of ways of getting supported, and people are more accepting of it as well. That's the thing. That in the past, if you said to somebody, "Oh, well, I've got an autistic spectrum disorder," you would be, they may not really understand the implications of that, or they may have thought, "Okay, well, that's not my problem. As an employer, that is not my problem." But now people are accepting that an individual with an autistic spectrum disorder, suspected or diagnosed, might actually, will be an asset to the company. And actually, there is a duty of, the employer has a duty to support them under employment law. And reasonable adjustments could be altering the time that you join and leave the workplace, whether the operation of your work can be broken into chunks, whether you need different sorts of supervision, whether you need sensory sort of, the environment, so the sensory side of the environment is altered, all kinds of stuff like that.
And when you say in the past to now, are you talking within the last couple of decades that you've been doing this, or have you seen this change significantly in that time?
I mean, not directly, but sort of by kind of, by repute of, hearing adult speakers who have kind of gone into the employment world, hearing from employers who are talking about what they're doing, like teachers and careers advisors saying how they've been supporting young people going into employment and through universities. There's a sort of a general shift. I mean, again, it might be worth doing a research project on, asking HR departments, how they think things have changed. There's probably government data somewhere would do that. But I mean, there's more understanding of autism in the media. There's more positive expressions of autism. Very successful people who may be, multimillionaires may have an autistic spectrum disorder,
right.
and they should be. They're a role model for other young people, and it can be a really positive attribute.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a couple of times when we were talking about schools and just as well, about children maybe not being diagnosed or adults making it through to adulthood not diagnosed. Is it heavily underdiagnosed?
It would be difficult to say whether it is heavily undiagnosed, because we're using diagnostic figures to inform the expected levels of diagnosis. So it's a bit circular.
Yeah.
So if you say we've diagnosed, 2 in 100 children have a diagnosis of autism, then you're looking for 2 in 100.
And then expect it to be,
Yeah. And then in a few years' time, you say, oh, well, the level of diagnosis has gone up. So rather than thinking, has the criteria become more flexible, you might then say, well, actually, we now expect the criteria to be 4%. So it's a very tricky one to talk about. And it may be that we're more familiar with it and it's always been there, and that's why the level's gone up. It may be that we're over-diagnosing and because people are desperate to attribute children's difficulties to something, and then let's call it autism. And I'm not saying that is the case, but that might be. And the other one is that some people feel that there might be environmental factors, which I don't know if that's the case, but it could be. There are so many things that impinge on our lives, in the food that we eat, the buildings that we live in, the water supply, everything has, more chemical. I'm sounding as if I'm a bit of a hippie talking about all of this.
Listen, the reason I'm smiling, the reason I'm smiling is I'm deciding whether or not to ask a question. I'm not going to push you for an answer, but we are skirting very close to the question of vaccines and anti-vaccination here. I mean, do you have any comments on that?
So you're talking about the triple vaccine
link, the supposed link between vaccination.
Well, as far as I understand, the vaccination research, my understanding is, and I'm not saying this, I mean, I may be wrong, and I hold my hands up if I am wrong, but the research was debunked, and that actually in some way the data that the guy used to analyze has been misrepresented. I don't know if that was on purpose or because it was skewed data, but there is some feeling that it's not true. But I don't know, I've been doing lots of additional reading, and I don't think it's as simple as all of those kind of things. And there's several other factors at play here. We don't really know the cause of autism,
right?
In as much as it could be a combination of factors, a genetic predisposition. There could be epigenetics, which is you have a predisposition and then there's an environmental impact. Yep. There's all kinds of things. We're not even sure where it's located. There's issues about mirror neurons, about sizes of grey cells, about this, about that. So it's so broad, it would be really, really difficult to sort of have a kind of call on it.
Yeah. And to what extent, I mean, we're getting quite technical here beyond my level of understanding. I mean, to what extent is it likely that if you've got two autistic children, obviously, we now use the term spectrum much more than I think we used to. It used to be autism and then it was the spectrum, and now the spectrum is invoked as the term far more. How likely is it that when you've got two children, that they will be really very, very different, that it will manifest very different? I mean,
that's just what Yeah, that was a good point. You've reminded me of something that I was going to say, which directly feeds into that. So, because as I finished, I was thinking, I've forgotten about something I wanted to say. So, the point being is that the more we look at the different conditions that exist, but through genetic screening, the more we realise that something that initially looked like autism is no longer called autism. So autism
that is happening.
Yeah, so autism is only used, that term, when there isn't any other explanation for it. That's a kind of a lay kind of expression for it. So if you have a slight genetic difference, it may express itself in something that is poor attention, learning difficulties, poor empathy, blah, 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 blah. But you have the explanation of, well, we've identified where it comes from because it is a deletion of, a number and then a letter and then a full stop and then another number, and it shows you where it's located. So it's very likely that autism will be sort of nibbled. It'll be nibbled away at because they have been identified as different goods. So that's kind of what I wanted to say, but it feeds into what you were saying, is that when you meet children with autism, they can be similar-ish, but they can also be very different. So the environment plays a part, their personality plays a part, and the level of intelligence plays a part as well. So those are factors that are involved. And there's someone, I'm trying to remember who it is now, Lorna Wing maybe, or Jeanette, or Lorna Wing or Gould, one of the two, has described sort of 5 different profiles of children who've got autism. This is off the top of my head, so I can't. One is that they may be a very pedantic sort of child, and they may seem rule-driven and polite. One is that they're shy and they don't talk at all. And there are a number of different profiles that they're generally true. They're not like, it's exactly that, and it's exactly that, and it's exactly that. But they're sort of generalities. So if you had 2 children and they both have a diagnosis of autism, you could have one that is sort of very active, seeks social interaction, but is perceived to be unusual. So that would be the group that's called active and odd. I mean, that's a strange way to describe it, but that is the technical term or the terminology that's used. And then you might have one that is another child who doesn't make eye contact and is very withdrawn, but they've still got autism. And there's something about it that is different between both of them. So there's as much variety in the children with autism in terms of their personality, their experiences, and what they bring with them, as there is in the typically developed world. Their common things is that they may have high levels of anxiety, sensory sensitivities, poor levels of empathy. They can't get inference, so they don't get figures of speech, so that they can't follow a conversation, and they can't get social cues. So those are the things that are similar.
Good. Wow. I think there's so much we could spend hours talking about here.
But, we've done really well. I think
we've probably got it. I gather as well, as I said, everything that we've talked about there, I think we've probably touched the surface, and there's a lot of depth. I gather you've mentioned videos and things. Is there a place where people can find some of the videos that you've made? Is there somewhere that people can look for these?
It's on I've got an Edge Psychology YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel is, the video is called Promoting Readiness to Return to School. Bit of a mouthful.
We'll put the links in. We'll put the links in with the video later. Okay, good. Is there anywhere else that you would recommend people go, either to find you and some of your work, or if they're interested in learning more about these topics, is there somewhere they should go?
There is, I mean, it's a massive field, so I would be reluctant to kind of recommend anywhere. I mean, if you were based in the UK and you wanted to know more about it, you would go to the National Autistic Society, and that gives a level of understanding and the perspective of an individual with autism. You might be an adult and you want to look at it. You might want to be a parent. I mean, you might be a parent, not want to be a parent. You might be a parent. And want more information, or you might be a teacher, so that would be one place. There's all kinds of places. My website is www.edgepsychology.org, and my web. I've only just put the YouTube channel up, so I don't know how you'd find it, but it's just Edge Psychology, and the snappy title for the thing is Promoting Readiness to Return. So,
brilliant. Like I say, I'll put some links in the bottom, so anybody who's watching this, you can look underneath and find the links to those, I imagine. And thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for chatting. It's been really quite inspiring. Thanks a lot.
Oh, good. No, I'm glad you think that's been fascinating for me, and I hope for the people listening as well, or watching. So brilliant. Thanks a lot, Simon. And I'll speak to you again soon, I'm sure.
Okay. Cheers then. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.